local history students. So we are at the Pioneer Cemetery at the west end of Prosser, and I'm with a Prosserite, longtime Prosserite, Mr. Carroll, Fred Carroll, and he's going to walk us through the Pioneer Cemetery and some historical information about it.
Like she said, my name is Fred Carroll. I was born here in Prosser in 1946. Graduated in 1965. Was in the Navy from 65 to 70. Got out of the Navy and worked for the city of Prosser roughly 20 years, from 72 to 92. Then I went to work for Benton County Public Works for another 10 years. Then I retired from all that and took a job at the Cemetery Association. And that's kind of how I got involved with learning the history of all this. And I worked for the Cemetery Association from 2002 to 2012, and then I volunteered ever since then. I believe this site was originally a potter's field. A potter's field is a biblical origin for a burial of strangers, paupers, and indigent folks. Potter's fields, actually what they were, they removed the dirt to get down to the soil that they could use for making pots and pans and all that. Kind of originates in England, where they had a lot of real clay soil, and we have it here too. Anyway, that's where the potter's field deal comes from. The railroads began searching around for a place to come through here about 1870. And about 1887 is when the railroad came through Prosser. They had needed a place to bury. They buried here, and I also think that they buried in Prosser at the site there.
Okay.
We can talk about that when we talk about that cemetery. The International Order of the Oddfellows took possession of this site in 1904. There are a whole bunch of graves before that. 1883, I think, was the date I was trying to come up with this a little while ago, and it's in my notes here.
How many graves do you think are here, Mr. Carroll?
Cora Mason came out here and counted 147 headstones, and she wrote down, that's the only records we have of this. I'll talk about that in a minute, but the only records we have is a lady came out here and wrote down everything that was on every headstone.
Okay.
Matter of fact, I have that right here.
Wow, okay.
The Oddfellows lost title to this site in a series of bank foreclosures, and it had to do with the Depression, and they couldn't pay their irrigation bill. So it pretty much got repossessed by the irrigation company. Well, if you're an irrigation company, what do you do with a repossessed cemetery? Well, the Prosser Cemetery Association, which is a private little association in town, they got kind of connived into, hey, you already have one cemetery, you need another one. So they took it on. But they're a pituitary care facility. Which means that the funds that they take, they set a certain amount of it aside so the place would be taken care of forever. This site did not have that. And so there's no one to take care of it. And the Prosser Cemetery Association is privately owned. It's not city or county or anything.
Oh, okay.
Everybody thinks it is, because most of the cemeteries around here are owned.
Yeah.
That's not the case with the Prosser Association.
So when about did they stop burying people here? Do you know?
The last buried is 1953, and I'll point that one out.
Okay, 1953.
They burned all the records. About 1946-47 is when it all kind of came to a head. There wasn't any money to take care of the place. They were being repossessed. They didn't have any water. So the story goes that the records, there are no records. The only records we have is Cora Mason crawling around. Out
yes.
Writing everything down.
And that's what historians do, is they crawl around and they keep records, and you never know who's going to need them later.
Even the cemetery in town, all the records were kept in a pocket notebook in Harley Chapman's pocket. And just until recently, when the computer aids came along, is when we're finally getting records. This place didn't even have a fence.
Yeah.
Until the 80s. Matter of fact, the flagpole got moved, but 1989 was the Washington State Centennial. The FAA boys took this on as a project.
Yes.
And tried to, and that's the monument right over there.
Okay.
We can talk about that when we walk through. this site's been in limbo for a long time. It had no water, it went to weeds, fires came through. A lot of the early headstones were wood. Well, you think, well, wait a minute, you know, you're out in the middle of nowhere. How do you get a fire out here? Well, you got a railroad track right there. And old steam trains are a wonderful, sentimental thing until you stand by one. And then you get all the dirt and the crud and the cinders and Hot Wheels on trains. And so that's how fires start.
Okay.
You see there's an area, it doesn't look like there's any gravestones out here. Well, there aren't. Because the cemetery, the fence used to be right here.
Okay.
In the course of some of the volunteerism and all that went along, they surveyed the place. And when they surveyed it, they kind of, hey, there's 2 more acres that belong to the cemetery.
Here. Okay.
So there, as far as we know, there are no burials out here.
Okay.
And people often ask, well, why don't they bury out here now? Well, we really don't know where, except for the headstones that are here. We don't want to dig up Grandma.
Yes. Yes.
So it's
best if you just kind of leave where things
leave
are.
it is. Yeah, they could possibly. There's a logistics issue too, because you have to have equipment. In the old days, and I talk about that a little bit, they hand dug everything. You see the old cowboy movies, you always see a mound of dirt in the graveyards. Well, what they would, now they displace the dirt. You have concrete liners, you put it in the ground, and you take away the excess dirt. Well, in the old days, they had a wooden box, or a lot of times people were just wrapped in a blanket.
Yeah.
And so everything settles. So the mound of dirt over time, the elements, all that, everything was settled out. Cora Mason got involved with this because she was doing oral histories going around. I think you probably talked about that. And these people kept telling stories, and she found out there were no records that anybody could. So far, we haven't found. There might be some out there, but nobody's come forward.
Yeah. Okay.
And everybody's pretty much gone now.
Yes.
So. My information has been gleaned from newspaper articles, Paul Friedland's books. You got to do more than look at the pictures.
Yes.
Read the stories.
Yes.
Because they're very interesting. And there was also a very dedicated group of volunteers over the years. A couple of high school girls came out and made it a summer project. And finally, must have been early 90s, Maxie Bennett, Bev Stone, and Wynn Taylor decided that something had to happen out here. Somebody needed to take some responsibility. Who owns it? And they kind of, Maxie was a Benton County commissioner, and that kind of helped for,
yes.
He got to digging around, and it was his influence with the SVID they had no money, but there's runoff water, so that we were able to tap into the runoff water, and with volunteers and funds gleaned here and there, they were able to get water to the place. And then they found out, wait a minute, Prosser Cemetery Association owns it. And it was a $1 deal,
yes.
You know, a good old boy deal. You know, what does the SVID have to do with the cemetery? That kind of thing. Anyway, these 3 people, and they gleaned a bunch of other folks. They really started putting pressure on to figure out, how do we do this? Well, the Prosser Cemetery Association is in between a rock and a hard place, because that's a pituitary care facility. They can't take their money and spend it out here, you know. But they were able to look at the laws and try to figure out, and they set up a fund, and they have people donating to the fund, and that's why it looks like it does now.
Yeah. So who takes care of it today? Who's in charge of the groundskeeping?
Prosser Cemetery Association
Okay.
they own it. And what they have done is they got a landscaping company to somewhat, it's a bid deal, but they also do some in-kind stuff, and they come out and mow it, and we do have water to it. So it's a combination of
yes.
There's still volunteers working on it. The graves will, you know, there's still a lot. This is a work in progress. It will be for a long time, but it's green now.
Yes, where it wasn't for a very
long
long time.
Before.
Yes.
There are many styles of headstones. Like I said, this was a potter's field. So you have some like this is a petrified rock that Mr. Goolsby carved in here. This was planted in 1936. This is not the original location of this headstone. When I started working here, we found it back over by the tree. But it's pretty unique, and there are a lot of unique ones out here. Started out, everything was wood. Put a wooden cross on there. Well, the elements and fire kind of take your toll, and even the elements really do take a toll with headstones too. And like
so
this
he's
one
not
here,
necessarily buried here.
Not at this site. She
No.
is out here somewhere.
She is, okay.
But we don't know where.
Okay, but yeah,
Yeah,
got it.
Yeah, I don't know why they decided to move it here. Maybe because it was a prominent place and somebody wouldn't try to steal it.
Yeah,
But they put it closer to the road too.
okay. Yeah.
Why people steal headstones, I don't know, but that has happened. Vandalism happens. A lot of these marble headstones, like this little white one over here, it's been broken and glued back together.
Okay.
Like this little marble. Marble was very popular in the early days because it's easy to carve. Everything was hand carved in the old days. Now this is a brass. They used to do a lot of brass too. It doesn't weather real well, but this is granite. Granite holds up. That's still shiny and slick. That holds up pretty good. Marble absorbs the moisture. Now these used to have like a lamb's head or something on it, and marble is real soft, and so the head's gone, and it's real porous, so it absorbs moisture, and that's why they turn black. They get moldy.
Looks like it was a child, so the lamb kind of makes sense.
Well, that's the other thing I was going to say.
2-year-old.
There are 42 children out here under the age of 12.
Under the age of 12, okay.
And a lot of it had to do with the pandemic that happened in 1918. I was just reading about that in the book today.
Yeah.
Trying to keep these things straight, and that there are no liners. Now, liners didn't really come about until even the 50s.
And what do you
They
mean
were
by liners?
A concrete box to put the casket in.
Okay.
Before that, it was like a wooden box or just people were in a blanket. Well, everything settles. The body decays and all that kind of thing. So you get a hole. You call that a sink. So, and the headstones wobble. And that's the other thing I should have said at the beginning. They're the way a lot of cemeteries do it. It's not a rule, but the man and woman, the man's on the left, woman's on the right. Woman's on the left, man's on the right, facing the rising sun. So the head would be here, feet would be out there. So where you're walking etiquette, you don't want to walk on a body. If you're walking up here, you're probably just below the feet of that one. And so if you kind of walk in between, you're not actually walking on somebody.
So the headstone is actually, the body is this way,
Yeah.
facing the rising
the head
sun,
would be
facing
the rising
east.
sun.
Whereas I
One
think
on the left, man on the right.
some people tend to think that it's this way,
This
and
way.
this is at the head.
That's
Okay.
a question I answered all the time when I was working at the
Yes.
cemetery.
And is that the
You'll
practice?
see some of these headstones are turned around the other way too, where like those right there, the writing's on the other side of the headstone. I don't know what reason-
direction?
Maybe that's a main driveway through the middle there. That's probably what the deal is, because we used to get that at the other cemetery all the time. I want to be able to read my headstone from the road, so
Yeah.
you turn it around. This set of headstones here has a little bit of sentimental value to me. Ida Raleigh she passed away just a couple of years ago. She was 103 years old. And I met her years ago when I worked for the city. And then when I walked Lincoln Grade, she was getting older. And so we used to stop and visit with her all the time. And when I was at the cemetery, she came out there and she said, "Fred, I've got a sister that died in 1904 at the old cemetery. And she doesn't have a headstone." So I poured this head. She bought this headstone, and I poured it. And we brought it. I think we set it about 2007. But her little sister, it says here she was 5 years old. This was her mother. Her mother died.
1917.
Yeah. Yeah, she died in 1917. The baby was born in 1950 and then died in 1920. So the baby died after her mother did. And I don't remember what Miss Raleigh said. But anyway, this just worked on her all these years that the baby didn't have a headstone. So she has a proper headstone. When you come up upon an old headstone, this one's not too hard to read if you get up close to it. Shaving cream will not hurt the headstone. It's soap. You buy a can of cheap shaving cream, come up and spray the headstone that you want to read. Use something as a squeegee it off, and it'll be all white, and you could read and you can read what's on the headstone. And some of these are very difficult to read.
Yeah.
Our family plots out here. This is one of the more difficult ones to see because it's marked by 4 corner markers. This is the Hayden plot, and there's an H in the top of each one of these markers on each corner here. Now, as opposed to that spot down there, that's also a family plot, but it's bordered by a concrete border, and you can tell. This one's a little different. That was the cornerstone guy, Mr. Hayden, and then all the family members are individual graves in here. I think there's like 8.
Perfect.
This is Mr. Wilgus. He's the guy that the road's named after, out here, the road that runs from Olin and Empire North. He was also, he arrived here in September of 1883 in this area, and very active man. Got appointed as a justice of the peace, and he was a justice of the peace for 40 years.
So justice of the peace, he would have.
It says here he died in 1924.
He would have married people.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Married people, and he was the judge.
Yeah.
That's what the justice of the peace did. I picked up on this because I saw Wilgus. I know Wilgus Road, and then I have the little book that was written. This is one where it'd be handy to have the soap. But this is hand carved, and Emma Jenks is mentioned in one of Paul Friedland's books. She died of blood poisoning, and she was the wife of a livery stable guy in town. They were rather affluent. He had a little money. He sent her. They went to Seattle to try to figure out what was wrong with her. That she, very pretty lady too, and she soon, and she was pretty young, 32 years old. So I guess might have been old then, but he was given a military headstone. I don't know how to decipher exactly which war he might, or which era he might have been in, but could have been Civil War, probably Spanish American, might even have been World War I. But it says William M. Badger, Company G, 9th Indiana Infantry. I don't know how to decipher that. Maybe one of you guys can.
Yeah, like a Google
get
search.
On the computer and figure it out. We run into quite a few of that, and we'll find another one we can talk about too.
But the one next to it gives some clues, doesn't it, Mr. Carroll?
Yes. This is the wife of William M. And she died in 1885, was born in 42 and died in 1885. So that kind of gives you a time frame, as they were probably close to the same age.
Yeah, and some of the first people here, because 1885 is very early in Prosser history.
Well, yes, because 1870 was when the railroad guys first started showing up surveyors.
Yeah.
So, and people had been coming through, but the railroad wasn't here yet. The railroad is really what opened things up, getting people moving around.
Absolutely. Okay.
And this is one where 2 years old, died in 1885. So here's another real early one. This is one where you can read it pretty good.
Yeah.
And here's another. This is probably Henry Creason. This is probably That one's creasing over there, but this is probably Dad right here.
Well, that one says aged 1 year,
Oh, baby, another baby.
8 months, and 8 days.
Yeah, son of. Yeah.
So looks like it was 2 children.
Yeah.
Yeah. Died 5 years later. It really is. Yeah. It was very common for small children to pass.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, there's like 42 of them out here under the age of 12. That and we know that just from reading the headstones.
Yeah.
These headstones are interesting for for 3 reasons. One of them is they're made from concrete, handmade with agates. This is Fred and Emma Warnicki, and Emma was the very first school teacher in Prosser, and she lived a long life. She lived like 81. Mr. Warnicki died in 1912. Anyway, she was the very first teacher, and like I said, it's unique because it's handmade. They used agates. It's held 1912.
Yes.
And
most of them are still there.
Usually concrete will suck moisture.
Yeah.
And but these have held up pretty well over the course of time. This guy was a Civil War veteran, and his name was Elias Garlow. He was a White House guard at the end of the Civil War, and his claim to fame, and there's an article about it in one of Paul Friedland's books, his claim to fame was he guarded the unmarked grave of John Wilkes Booth.
Ah.
When
yes.
You know, they caught up with him and he died, and but they didn't want to mark his grave in any way, so they sent Garlow out to guard that grave until they could get it properly covered, all that kind of thing. But he was a sergeant in Company F for the 144th New York Infantry. That's another one you guys can look up. This headstone right here is interesting in the fact that Paul Friedland ran across a bunch of photographs that had been taken by Mr. Wilder, and when he worked for the newspaper, and this and Mr. Wilder and his photographs inspired Paul Friedland to write the first of the 4 history books of Prosser. Yeah, this is Mr. Wilder. He also owned aside from being a photographer and kind of a prominent person in town, he also had one of the very first automobiles. He had a Franklin, which is a very, very large, air-cooled, very heavy car. And electric starts didn't come along until the 20s, late 20s. And the late 20s for Ford, or a little earlier for that for some of the fancy cars. So he's out in front of this great big old car cranking it, and somehow it got kicked into gear. He must have left it in gear. Anyway, it started. He's out in front with the crank, and it ran over him and killed him dead. So he's been out here since 1910.
First car fatality.
First car fatality.
In Prosser.
That we're aware of.
Yeah.
And a lot of times these deals here would have paper in there. It would tell you what was going on. Well, that's not going to work.
Right.
Even temporary. But there's obviously several, probably children.
Okay.
Babies, I would think. I don't know anything about it other than it's a rock. Probably came from the home place.
Yeah.
But you know, I have pictures that Paul Friedland in his book took of this in 1983, and it looks just like this.
And is that paint or is that
I don't know.
Yeah.
If it's paint, it sure held well. So maybe it's some kind of a concoction. My thought is it's been there a very long time.
Yes.
But all we know is what we see.
Yeah.
They all have stories. We just don't know what they are.
You know what? Sometimes history is mystery.
The reason I flagged this particular headstone is because I believe it's the last one, the last berry that we're aware of out here, 1953. The other interesting thing is the name Wealthy. I think it's a woman because John Snyder is over here and Wealthy is next door, and I've never heard of another Wealthy, so we had to make note of that one. This fellow owned my grandmother's house, and she lived on Guernsey at Yakima Avenue, and I have a picture. It's in Friedland's book too, but I have a photograph that my dad had of the Rasmussen family, and sitting in their old with their fine china out and all that, having a picture in their home. I'm not sure if it's the same Rasmussen, but the one that lived in my grandmother's house was Charles Rasmussen. This is Charles Rasmussen. This is the guy who died in 1914. He was a bartender, and he was murdered. I think they closed down, about 14 is about when they shut down the taverns in town, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, he had an unruly patron that took exception to the fact that he got thrown out of the tavern. So when Mr. Rasmussen was walking home from work, he got shot. And I know that this is the Rasmussen that got shot. Now I'm guessing that it's the Rasmussen that lived in my grandmother's, that my grandmother bought her house.
Which wouldn't have been far from downtown, the bars.
Yeah, not far. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Well, my grandfather worked at the mill, the flour mill, and he lived there, and he just walked to work.
Yeah.
You know, everybody, nobody had cars. They didn't have money. My grandparents came here in 1922. I picked it up from just reading Paul's book. Aside from being a really cool headstone, this guy died in 1907. He was in town. He was waiting for his wife, who was in one of the shops, and he was leaning up against a pole outside when lightning struck the pole and killed him dead. And this is a really neat, for 1907. This is a really ornate headstone.
And it reads, I don't know if you can zoom in, Haley, but it says, a precious one from us has gone, a voice we loved is still, a place is vacant in our home, which never can be filled. Oh, that's beautiful.
How do you pronounce his name?
Borgon?
That's what I thought.
Borgon?
This is now known as the Pioneer Cemetery. In the early days, like I said before, it was the Oddfellows, which is a fraternal organization, kind of had the run over it until they ran into their financial issues. The cemetery in Prosser was started by a man by the name of E.F. Benson, and to differentiate the two, that was the East Prosser Cemetery. This is the West Prosser Cemetery. This cemetery is not in the city limits. There was a time when Jay Chapman really worked hard to get the city to come out here and take care of this, but they're 3 miles from town, and town probably won't ever get out here, so that didn't go. But the E.F. Benson, I think it was a potter's field in town before Mr. Benson owned it, and then and he kind of incorporated it into being a cemetery in 1901. There were burials before that, and then I think it was 1919 when I can't think of all their names. Mr. Fry is one that comes. E.F. Fry is one that comes to mind. Mr. Wise, several fellows got together and decided that they wanted a perpetual care cemetery, and the way this one was run out here is what caused them to do that. They all took out $1,000 life insurance policies on themselves, with the beneficiary being the cemetery association, and that's how they kind of got going. And then they had some a couple of fellows around town that like to kind of play around with money a little bit, started investing their money for them, and that's how they became somewhat financially solvent. Cemeteries are a tough road to hoe. You're not going to make any money, and that's why cities and counties have taken them over for the most part. But Prosser's is still a private cemetery run by a board of people that are selected from the people that own plots out there. Every plot has a deed, and a lot of paperwork involved with all that too. But it's going along strong. I saw a picture recently that a friend of mine took in 1974. He was flying to Salt Lake City, and he flew out of I believe Pasco, and flew right over Prosser, and he took an aerial photograph, and you can see Prosser Cemetery sitting all by its side. That's before the stadium, before the new housing addition was built along Patterson Road there. That didn't come along until like '83. But anyway, there's this little green spot off over in the corner down below, and that's the Prosser Cemetery, the East Prosser Cemetery. Well, I've asked them to come up with closing thoughts, and one of the things I miss you guys for actually having kids out here to talk to, because there are questions you would like to ask, and you probably have relatives or grandparents or great-grandparents. If they're alive, talk to them now and try to write some stuff down. A lot of people are doing genealogy where you can get some information, but if you got grandma still around, go talk to her and ask stupid questions. The other thing is, come out to a cemetery and at your leisure and just walk around and read these headstones and look at them, and you'll probably find somebody's grandma out here, and try to learn the stories, and if you find something interesting, write it down. That's the only reason I know anything about any of this that I've talked about today, is the fact that somebody wrote it down, and we think it's accurate and correct. I don't like to pass on incorrect information, but you don't know. You know, just because it's written doesn't mean it's factual. But out here, what's written on the stone is written in stone.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you can learn from it is what weathers well and what doesn't. And if you have sometime in your future have to deal with something like this, you can see what works and what doesn't. It's all out here written in stone. And go talk to grandma.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll. It was a pleasure.